All right, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to talk about case law. I probably won't have time to talk about any very much. And I wish I could cede more time actually to the discussion about special juvenile immigrant status, because such a critically important subject. If I was telling my student Alyssa, who's here today, if I could go back to law school and was, we're talking about 20 years ago, right, when I was in law school, and study something, I think immigration law and special juvenile immigrant status may be kind of one of the most important things we could study right now from a social justice point of view, and in terms of helping people, the demand for lawyers who understand it. I also would have liked to see even more time to Judge Cohen, because the book program has really been a fantastic thing that my students have used. So I don't know how many of you parents, attorneys are familiar with the situation where maybe the parent's calling the foster home and the foster home kind of complains to the FSRP, well, the kid's really too young to have these phone calls, it doesn't really work, it's really kind of useless, right? So then the phone calls stop, right? But this is the perfect way to defeat that problem, right? Is to say, okay, well, let's make them more productive. Let's make them work for everybody and use the books. The books generally can't carry any critters or lice, unless they're cloth bound, maybe, I don't know. But I think that it's just been a great thing in a lot of our cases, and it's helped create more contact between kids and parents when they're in out-of-home care. Okay, so with regard to the case law, the thing that I hope you guys like best about these case law updates isn't, kind of me talking about the cases, but what the students did in creating the summaries for you. So your written materials have summaries of what we've decided are all the important cases you should know about from this year, right? And that's all of 2017 plus a bonus month of January of this year, right? And let me tell you a little bit about how we do the picking, right? So the students review the cases as they come out each month, right? Good kind of training tool for them to think about looking at all the newest cases and be keeping up on them as they're practicing. Plus, they learn a lot about juvenile law by reading them, right? Mostly about TPR, because that's what a lot of the appeals are, right? But still super important stuff. And then we look for some specific kinds of cases. We look for, one of the things I asked them to look for is longer opinions, right? Because they usually have something they're saying more than just kind of going through the factors and saying that the termination is affirmed. We of course always really focus on reversals, right? And then we also look for cases with good dissents, right? Where there's some conflict, right? And the judges disagree about something. The other thing I always ask when I give out these materials and talk about them is if you guys see cases we're missing, right? Like if you appealed a case and had a really interesting decision or result and we've missed it in our summary, don't hesitate to email me or call me and tell me to add it, because we do this kind of about 3 or 4 times a year. We also don't do a lot of editorializing in it, right? Like once I get up and start talking, I start editorializing a little bit. But in terms of, what the students are really trying to do is tell you what the nub of the case was, what the big issue was, and what the court decided to do about it. We also will try to cite some of the important decisions in it or quote from things that were particularly poignant in the opinion. So you'll see a little bit of that, but I hope the summaries help direct you to important case law that you might want to look at to go deeper, right? So that's the basic gist. I think originally the idea was that I was going to give you the top 10 things you had to know about our case law update, and I have 3 minutes left, so I'm not going to be able to do that. But let me just draw your attention to a few really important things, and we won't talk about them in detail, but I want to draw your attention to a few important things. One, we've got a couple of Supreme Court decisions this year, right? And they're really interesting. They're packed full of really interesting stuff. The other thing I'd say to you is when you read the decision, we have this great thing in Iowa where we record all of the Supreme Court arguments and they're all available on their webpage. When you read the decision, take 20 or 30 minutes to watch the oral argument. It's really amazing. You get a real sense of what the judges and justices are struggling over when they're making these decisions. And it's very illuminating, especially if one of your cases is going to go up, right? To kind of see the kinds of questions they ask. Two areas where we got Supreme Court cases this year, and I won't go into any big detail, but China adjudication, right? That's in re LH, and then the incarcerated parents case, right? The newest iteration of the incarcerated parents case, which is LM, right? So two big cases to look at, AS, right? Is the China adjudication case, and then I believe that it is LM is the incarcerated parent case. Really interesting conversations between the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court in those cases. Both of those cases are cases where a parent appealed from the district court. Court of Appeals agreed with the parent, right? And then the Supreme Court flipped it back, right? And really interesting conversations between the Supreme Court and Court of Appeals about what to do in those circumstances. And there's no time to go into it in detail, but I think, I just want to draw your attention to it and look at those cases for sure. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is this notion of the new permanency. Has anybody read any of the opinions that talk about the new permanency? Raise your hand if you've heard that phrase. Okay, yeah, so maybe one or two. There's a law review article by a friend of mine, actually, Josh Gupta-Kagan, who teaches at the University of South Carolina. And he's really questioning whether this traditional kind of favoritism we have towards TPR and adoption over guardianship is a good idea. He's pushing the idea that guardianship can be just as good, right? And we saw that played out in a couple of cases this year. We had in re BT, in which the Court of Appeals rejected a termination order and said, look, a guardianship should have been put in place for kind of an older youth. I think the child was around 11, 10 or 11, or a younger youth, I should say. And so you have that going on. And then you have AS, where a much, much younger kid was placed in a guardianship pursuant to the Court of Appeals opinion, or was going to be put in guardianship of his grandparents or her grandparents. And the Supreme Court flipped it back, really reaffirming the idea that we prefer termination and adoption over guardianship. Again, very interesting conversation between the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals on those questions, and worth reading for sure. The third point I'll make is I hear a lot of my county attorney friends complaining sometimes about reversals, that there were more reversals in the last couple of years in the Court of Appeals than there used to, I think. But I would really caution anybody making too big a deal out of that, right? So first of all, the vast majority of cases still get affirmed, right, in terms of numbers. But second of all, when you look at the cases that were reversed, rather than thinking about them as announcing a new principle of law, ask yourself whether they don't just really talk about failures of proof, right? So let's take BT as an example. That's the case where I think it was a 10 or 11-year-old was placed in guardianship rather than TPR, right? Like kind of the TPR was rejected. The Court of Appeals noted that there wasn't really any evidence put on by the county attorney in that case in support of the termination order other than the exhibits, right? That the GAL took no position on whether it should be termination or guardianship in the hearing, right? Didn't offer any evidence either. And that the only evidence that was offered was by the parent and her attorney about the close relationship and good relationship between the child and the parent, between the parent and the grandparent who had custody, that really, some of these cases aren't necessarily examples of big new announcements of law like the new permanency. They're really just more about kind of what evidence was offered. Was there a failure of proof? And so before you react too strongly to the reversals, think about that when you read them. Right? And it's a worthwhile thing to think about just as a trial attorney getting ready to do a case that might be up in the Court of Appeals at some point. Okay, so I've actually gone over by 2 minutes, but those are the main things I wanted to talk to you about with regard to our case law update. I hope you like it. Please tell me if you could think of things we can do better with it. My students really enjoy working on it. I think they do a really good job. Any errors in it are mine, not theirs, because I edit and I like calling it curate. I curate it when they're done with it. So yeah, let me know if there's anything we can do differently or you'd like to see in the case law updates. And thanks for the opportunity to talk about it.